Ethan had always thought of his apartment as a sanctuary. The dimly lit living room, the carefully chosen mid-century furniture, and the faint scent of cedarwood candles all reflected his desire for peace, a stark contrast to the chaos he'd left behind in his failed marriage 2 years ago. At 45, Ethan prided himself on his ability to maintain distance from the drama of the world outside, particularly in his quiet neighborhood, where boundaries were respected. That changed the day Caleb moved in next door. Caleb was 28, a personal trainer with a disarming smile and a presence that felt magnetic even in casual encounters. Ethan first noticed him in the elevator, hauling a stack of gym equipment and flashing an apologetic grin as one of the weights bumped against the paneling. Their initial exchange had been polite, mundane even, a nod, a shared complaint about the building's faulty heating system, but something lingered in Caleb's gaze. It wasn't overtly flirtatious, but it held a warmth that unsettled Ethan in ways he couldn't name. Over the weeks, their interactions became more frequent. Caleb's habit of jogging in the mornings coincided with Ethan's coffee routine by the window, and they'd exchange waves through the glass. Once, Caleb knocked on Ethan's door to borrow a screwdriver. They chatted for a while. Caleb was effortlessly charming, sharing stories about his upbringing in a small town and his aspirations of opening a fitness studio. Ethan found himself laughing more than he had in months. Still, he kept their relationship at arm's length, brushing aside the subtle stirrings of attraction with the excuse that Caleb was simply a friendly neighbor. It was late on a Thursday evening when the boundary Ethan had carefully maintained began to blur. The apartment was unusually quiet. Even the faint hum of city life seemed muted. Ethan sat on his couch, reading a book, when a sudden knock at the door jolted him. He opened it to find Caleb standing there, his usually composed demeanor replaced with something hesitant, almost vulnerable. "Hey, sorry for the surprise visit," Caleb began, rubbing the back of his neck. I locked myself out. I thought you might have the landlord's number or a spare key." Ethan blinked, momentarily caught off guard by Caleb's presence. He was dressed in casual clothes, a plain white t-shirt and sweatpants, but somehow managed to make the simplicity look effortlessly appealing. Ethan stepped aside, motioning for Caleb to come in. "I don't have a spare, but I do have the landlord's number somewhere," Ethan said, moving toward the kitchen counter. As he rummaged through a drawer, Caleb wandered into the living room. "Nice place," Caleb commented, his voice low. "Very." Ethan glanced over his shoulder, catching Caleb running a hand along the edge of a bookshelf. There was something intimate about the way he moved through the room, as if he belonged there. "Thanks," Ethan replied, turning back to the drawer and retrieving a slip of paper. "Here's the number. You can call from my phone if yours is locked in your apartment." Caleb didn't move to take the paper. Instead, he looked at Ethan with an expression that was hard to decipher, a mix of gratitude and something deeper, something unspoken. "You know," Caleb said, his voice softening, "you're the only person in this building who's ever been kind to me. Most people just nod and keep walking." Ethan felt a flush rise to his cheeks. He laughed awkwardly. "Well, I guess I'm just neighborly." Caleb stepped closer, the space between them shrinking to a few feet. "Neighborly," he repeated, his tone carrying a hint of amusement. "That's one way to put it." Before Ethan could respond, Caleb's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glanced at the screen, and sighed. "Looks like I'm saved. My roommate's back and can let me in." Ethan hadn't known Caleb had a roommate. The revelation brought a strange mix of relief and disappointment, though he couldn't say why. "Thanks for the help," Caleb said, his usual confidence returning. He paused at the door, turning back to add, "I owe you one, Ethan. Maybe I can take you out for coffee sometime." Ethan froze, unsure how to respond. But before he could find the words, Caleb was gone, leaving the door ajar and the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the air. As Ethan locked the door behind him, he found himself staring at the empty space where Caleb had stood. His sanctuary no longer felt quite so detached from the world outside. And for the first time in years, he wasn't sure if that was a bad thing. Ethan's weekend routine was simple. Wake up late, enjoy a slow breakfast, and lose himself in a book or an old record. But that Saturday morning, the rhythm was interrupted by a knock on the door. When he opened it, Caleb stood there, holding a steaming cup of coffee in a to-go cup. "Morning," Caleb said, flashing that disarming smile. "Thought I'd make good on the coffee offer." Ethan hesitated, glancing at the cup as if it were a dangerous proposition. "You didn't have to do that," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "I wanted to," Caleb replied, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Besides, I felt bad for barging in the other night." Ethan took the cup, the warmth seeping into his hands. "You were locked out. It's not like you had a choice." Caleb shrugged, his eyes scanning the room with casual curiosity. "Still, I'm not used to relying on people. Guess it's nice to know someone has my back." He paused, his gaze settling on Ethan. "You're different, you know." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" "Most people don't bother. They're too busy, too caught up in their own stuff. You actually notice people." Ethan felt his chest tighten at the sincerity in Caleb's voice. He tried to brush it off with a laugh. "I think you're giving me too much credit. I'm just a guy with a quiet life and a decent set of tools." Caleb stepped closer, closing the gap between them. "I don't think so," he said softly. "There's more to you than that." Ethan froze, the air between them thick with an unspoken tension. He could feel the heat radiating from Caleb, the scent of his cologne, a blend of cedar and something sweeter, lingering in the small space between them. "Caleb," Ethan began, his voice faltering. "Relax," Caleb said, his tone light but his eyes serious. "I'm not trying to make you uncomfortable." He took a step back, the momentary pressure lifting. I don't know. I feel like I can be honest with you." Ethan exhaled, though his heart was still racing. "Honest about what?" Caleb hesitated, his playful demeanor slipping. "About how lonely this city can feel sometimes. About how it's nice to have someone to talk to who doesn't expect anything in return." Ethan felt a pang of empathy. He knew that loneliness all too well, the kind that crept in during the quiet moments, filling the spaces left by past relationships and unfulfilled dreams. "You're not alone in feeling that way," Ethan said finally. "It's easy to get lost in a place like this." Caleb smiled, but there was a sadness in his eyes. "Yeah, but most people don't admit it." For a moment, they stood in silence, the words they didn't say hanging in the air. Then Caleb's expression shifted, the vulnerability replaced with a mischievous grin. "Anyway, thanks for letting me vent. Want to grab lunch later?" "My treat." Ethan hesitated. Accepting felt like crossing a line, though he couldn't articulate why. But before he could answer, Caleb's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and frowned. "Work stuff," Caleb muttered. "I should go." He turned to leave, but paused at the door. "Thanks for listening, Ethan. Seriously, I don't think I say that enough." Ethan nodded, his throat tight. "Anytime." When Caleb left, the apartment felt quieter than it had before. Ethan sat down, staring at the untouched coffee in his hands. He couldn't deny the pull he felt toward Caleb, an attraction that was as exhilarating as it was terrifying. He told himself it was harmless, a friendly connection, nothing more. But deep down, he knew that wasn't the whole truth. Later that evening, Ethan found himself unable to focus. The memory of Caleb's proximity, his words, his gaze, they replayed in his mind like a record stuck on a single track. Then came another knock. Ethan opened the door to find Caleb standing there again, this time with a sheepish smile. "I know I was just here," Caleb said, scratching the back of his neck. "But I figured if we're both just sitting around tonight, maybe we could keep each other company." Ethan hesitated, his instincts and desires waging a silent war. But before he could decide, Caleb added, "No pressure, just two neighbors hanging out." The words were casual, but the way Caleb looked at him was anything but. Ethan stepped aside, letting Caleb in. This time, he didn't bother locking the door. The night was a blur of conversation and laughter. Ethan wasn't sure when it happened, when the line he'd sworn to keep blurred into something unrecognizable. He only remembered the way Caleb leaned in, his voice dropping into something softer, something that felt like a confession, and the way his hand lingered on Ethan's arm as they shared a quiet moment on the couch. It wasn't supposed to happen. Ethan had told himself he was just being a good neighbor, offering company to someone who needed it. But when Caleb closed the distance between them and their lips met, all of Ethan's carefully constructed walls crumbled. Now the morning light seeped through the blinds, casting a pale glow across the living room. Ethan sat alone on the edge of the couch, staring at the half-empty coffee cups and the disheveled throw pillows that bore evidence of Caleb's visit. Caleb had left a few hours ago, his departure quiet and unceremonious, leaving Ethan to grapple with the weight of what had unfolded. The shame came first, a sharp pang in his chest. Ethan had always prided himself on his integrity, on his ability to navigate the complexities of his life without causing harm. But last night had shattered that self-perception. He stood and paced the room, his thoughts a chaotic storm. Caleb was young, carefree, and unattached. He could walk away from what happened without a second thought. Ethan, on the other hand, was tethered to the choices he'd made in the past. The echoes of his failed marriage reverberated in his mind, a reminder of the promises he hadn't been able to keep. Why had he let it happen? Was it the loneliness, the ache he'd been ignoring for years? Or was it something about Caleb specifically? The way he made Ethan feel seen in a way no one had in a long time. The knock on the door startled him, jolting him from his spiraling thoughts. For a brief moment, hope flared. Perhaps Caleb had returned, ready to talk about what had happened. But when Ethan opened the door, it wasn't Caleb. It was Andrew, Ethan's ex-husband. Andrew's expression was guarded, his eyes scanning Ethan's face. "I was in the neighborhood," he said simply. "Thought I'd stop by." Ethan stepped aside, his heart pounding for a completely different reason now. Andrew hadn't been in his apartment in over a year, not since they'd finalized the divorce. "I won't stay long," Andrew said, sitting awkwardly on the edge of the armchair. I found some of your old books while I was cleaning out the attic. Thought you might want them back." Ethan nodded, unsure of what to say. The presence of his ex felt like a cruel twist of fate, a stark reminder of the relationship he'd failed to protect and the new mistake he'd just made. Andrew glanced at the disarray in the living room, his gaze lingering on the coffee cups. "Looks like you had company." The comment was casual, but Ethan felt it like a punch. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Andrew's eyes softened. "You don't owe me an explanation, Ethan. We've both moved on, right?" Moved on. The words stung because they felt like a lie. Ethan wasn't sure he'd moved on at all. He'd simply existed in the aftermath, trying to make sense of who he was without Andrew. And now, after last night, he felt even more unmoored. "I'm trying," Ethan said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Andrew nodded, standing to leave. "For what it's worth," he said, pausing at the door, "you deserve to be happy, Ethan. I hope you find that." After Andrew left, Ethan sat back on the couch, his mind racing. Caleb's presence lingered in the room like a ghost, but so did Andrew's words. He realized he was at a crossroads, faced with a choice about the kind of person he wanted to be. Last night had been a moment of weakness, a surrender to emotions he hadn't fully processed. But now, in the light of day, he had to decide what came next. Would he let the mistake define him, or would he use it as a catalyst for change? Ethan picked up his phone, his thumb hovering over Caleb's number. He wanted to reach out, to explain, to understand what last night had meant to Caleb. But he hesitated. Perhaps the first step wasn't about Caleb at all. Perhaps it was about facing himself. As Ethan set the phone down and stared out the window, he felt the weight of his choices pressing down on him. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. He couldn't keep running from himself. And with that realization, He took a deep breath, ready to face whatever came next.